The first paper that I'll be presenting on behalf of myself and my co-author is called Networks of Care, and we looked at advocates who support survivors of technology abuse to understand their digital security practices. And so a lot of existing research on technology-enabled abuse can be roughly put into two buckets. So one on sort of defining the problem, looking at how this happens in practice, and then another on proposing solutions and recommendations. And what we argue in the paper is that with some very important exceptions, a lot of this research skips a step to looking at how responses on the ground in places like domestic violence shelters, sexual violence support services, what is actually happening already in terms of security on the ground. And this kind of research framing is heavily influenced by critical security studies and feminist security studies, which I'll get into in a second. But so the first kind of research has helped us understand what the phenomenon of technology-enabled abuse is, which is using technologies to scare, harass, coerce, or stalk someone, particularly in the context of an intimate relationship, although we note that this kind of abuse can also happen, for example, against sex workers, is commonly perpetrated by institutions, for example, by the police, but in this study we're primarily looking at intimate relationships. We also use the language of coercive control rather than domestic abuse, which reflects a broader move in the field to reflect that people who experience coercive control aren't necessarily cohabitating, as domestic might imply, and aren't necessarily like physically violent, but it could be this pattern of coercion and control. When this incorporates technology, this can look like having access to someone's account because, for example, you purchase a device. It could include device compromise, harassment, malicious exposure, which could be like non-consensual sharing of intimate images, outing someone, and then gaslighting, which is using technology to undermine people's perception of their own reality, for example, through smart home devices. We also draw on research from the Cornell Tech team, which talks about a UI-bound adversary. So that's someone who's not very technically sophisticated, but someone against whom a lot of conventional security techniques may be inadequate, for example, because they can guess or coerce a password. Crucially, many survivors will live with abuse for many years because it's extremely difficult to leave abusive relationships. So protecting against abuse may look like helping someone protect their security while in an abusive relationship and not necessarily just helping them leave that relationship. And lastly, but crucially, abuse is intersectional, so it will disproportionately target women. It's disproportionately perpetrated by men, but it will often fall also on other axes of oppression. So for example, people with disabilities experiencing intimate partner abuse may face the additional problem that assistive technologies are taken away by their abuser, leaving them with extra vulnerabilities. And then in terms of what has been done for exploring solutions and recommendations, a lot of existing research looks at recommendations for survivors, for example, safety advice. This has a big pitfall in that it risks putting more what's called safety work on survivors. So people who are already in a very kind of often dire situation, facing a lot of cognitive, emotional, physical strain, shouldn't be kind of given more responsibility to protect themselves, although they are, of course, their first line of defense, and this work is also very important. So another field of research looks at technical recommendations, for example, improving threat modeling or other design techniques. People like Hera Hussein at Chen have developed trauma-informed design. And this kind of research can sometimes jump to providing a technical solution. And then a last line of research is looking at developing services, for example, community-based participatory action research projects like the ones at New York or Seattle, which are really great, and have produced really helpful guides for securing devices, have pointed out that seeking relief through the conventional criminal legal system can often be ineffectual or even re-traumatizing, and are trying to think outside of that. In terms of the kind of theoretical influence from critical security studies is that critical security studies looks at security as a set of practices. So things like predictive policing, various forms of surveillance, data mining. It sees security as that rather than like as a state of being secure or insecure. And so in this study, we look at security practices. And then we also draw on feminist security studies, which kind of seeks to challenge this distinction between personal versus political. So conventionally, a lot of security research will focus on things like terrorism or war, even though statistically speaking will often cause much less violence and harm than things like domestic violence or coercive control. It also generally kind of challenges distinctions between activism versus research. Feminism is a sort of political movement first, which then influences these theoretical approaches. And that's very visible, particularly in this focus on care and care practices. So a lot of feminist security research will see security as sort of this emotional and practical labor dealing with breakdowns of social relations. And that's been applied to the digital sphere, and for example, the work of Shea Akiwowo, looking at things like digital self-care. I'm going to skip forward. So in terms of the actual methods we used 26 semi-structured qualitative interviews, people from the kind of conventional gender-based violence, domestic violence sector, like I said, shelters or human trafficking and sexual violence support services, but also people coming more from the digital privacy space, people like hacking collectives who've specifically started to focus on supporting survivors of abuse. And also specifically recruited for participants who support groups like sex workers or queer people who might be excluded from the traditional gender-based violence sector. And we tried to follow various feminist methodologies, for example, looking at citation politics. We gave participants the option to be cited by their name so that they would be credited similarly to the way an academic might be in a research paper. And we also involved our participants in a data walkthrough workshop, so they were part of the data analysis and tried to make our positionality clear in the paper. So moving on to the findings, we identified 5 primary support practices. So first of all, advocates will try to establish trust and belief before offering any kind of security advice. To avoid sort of the disempowering effects that a lot of conventional security advice might create. They had a variety of different safety planning practices, many of which kind of included an idea of demystification of the abuser and empowerment of the survivor. And so these kind of support practices will often intertwine sort of a level of technical knowledge, being able to tell different vectors of compromise, as well as sort of emotional support. So understanding the effects of gaslighting, understanding how an abuser might misrepresent their technical power. As Eva Galperin from the Electronic Frontier Foundation said, for a lot of people, technical knowledge and computer security is essentially magic. So it's very easy to use the appearance of that knowledge to make yourself seem omniscient and omnipotent, and often that alone is enough to manipulate the victim. So to provide this kind of support successfully, advocates would have to have quite a lot of both emotional knowledge of sort of how trauma might affect a survivor and the technical knowledge to be able to tell apart sort of alleged use of stalkerware or something more sophisticated from something that's much more common, like compromise on the basis of a Facebook account or an email password. Advocates also supported evidence collection and would make referrals, which kind of brings me to the next area of findings, which is what we've called networks of care. So we found that a lot of the actual practices, a lot of the actual work that advocates are putting in is in developing relationships with people in their community. Like Susan Hickey, an advocate, said, "I really like when car companies will say, yes, sure, I'll come and look at your car. Maybe they're not going to see everything, but I think it just provides a survivor that support that's so important to know that there are people that care." So that was something I found quite surprising, is that quite a lot of advocates talked about reaching out to local car companies to have a car mechanic who'd be able to check a car for trackers. But that would often involve these processes of not just building a relationship, but also educating people on how domestic violence or gaslighting might work in practice, making sure there's people that are trustworthy enough to refer a survivor to within the local community. And all of this is kind of with the aim of building a more supportive and caring environment for survivors. Advocates had a lot of really interesting recommendations for change, which due to time considerations, I'm going to mostly skip over. But these would include sort of very conventional privacy or safety by design recommendations, but also kind of called for a general rethinking of how technology is designed in a way that would be more relational with people working on the ground who are spotting problems on the ground. So you can have this dynamic, like Natalie Dolce said, where people are raising problems and that's responded to promptly. We have two kind of broad calls or implications from this research. One is that I think these advocates are technical workers, they're cybersecurity workers, even if they're not recognized as such. And I think they should be recognized and compensated as such, because even if they're not experts in cryptography, they have a lot of sort of very valuable experience of how technology is abused on the ground. And secondly, this kind of networked care, building these kind of relationships are very critical to how people, particularly vulnerable, marginalized people, get security. And I think that resonates well with the previous presentation as well. And I think if we recognize and understand these kind of networks, then we as security researchers can build on top of them and try to strengthen them rather than sort of parachuting in a technical recommendation or solution without understanding the work that people are already doing on the ground. So that's the first presentation. I think I'll pause for questions now and then do the next one.
Thank you very much.